All right, so first off, I'd love if you could all kind of tell us about your relationship to photo books and also highlight one of your favorite photo books. And I also have the slides, so you can let me know which ones to flip through.
Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Noah, and thanks to AIPAD and Fotografiska for having us. I think my relationship with photo books really started with my relationship to photography, which was in high school when I took a darkroom photography class. And I went to high school in rural New Hampshire, and so there was a total lack of access to kind of museums or institutions where I could really engage with photography in a considered way. So photo books really, for me, provided that access. And I remember looking at books like Edward Weston's Flame of Recognition or Sally Mann's Immediate Family, and just spending a lot of time with those, studying them. And I think that experience really helped my interest in photography bloom. Long story short, I went to college, I studied photography, and wound up working at Aperture, where I've been for the last few years. At Aperture, I work on the editorial team, where I work with artists, writers, designers to think of photo book projects and then all of the kind of intricate steps to make that book happen and put it out in the world. So I'm very happy to have that experience behind me, and it's been a great learning opportunity. In terms of my favorite photo book, the book that I thought of when I heard this question was Rinko Kawauchi's Utatane. And I think it's just a really wonderful example of the kind of simple but really effective way that photo books as a medium can really elevate work on a small scale. It was published in the early 2000s and was kind of part of a trifecta of photo books that really brought Rinko's work to an international audience. And it collects her kind of signature square format photographs taken from everyday life, but she has such an attention to kind of these dreamlike moments, these surreal moments, and the images themselves are really laden with kind of metaphor and symbolism in a wonderful way. I think that is all kind of elevated by the way you have to engage with that work as you flip through the book and view the images in these pairings. It really kind of activates that underlying gestalt psychology that's embedded in photography, where when you're looking at two images together, a kind of new meaning arises. And it's a really fantastic book. I look at it often, and it's just a real pleasure. So that's one of my favorites.
Miwa?
Okay. My relationship with photo books started like 20 years ago. Before working for the bookstore in a Soho, Dashwood Book, I used to work at the lawyer's office as a paralegal. I was there for 8 years, but I always want to switch my career from like a legal service to art. Then while I was working at the lawyer's office, I was thinking about that as an immigrant from Japan, I came here like over 25 years ago and then went to a graduate school and then, as a Japanese and a female, I noticed that the photo book was like a kind of popular 20 years ago, and then needed to work for somebody who really understands that the Japanese photography. Noticed that David, owner of the Dashwood Book, looking for assistant. I applied for it. In fact, I didn't really like to working at the bookstore at the beginning because I didn't want to carry the heavy box and stuff like that. And then I felt like a customer service was a pain in the neck. But in fact, I was looking for a position at the auction house and the gallery and then other fancy places, but none of the specialists focus on Japanese photography. So it was just like a last chance for me to use my background. So that's the reason why I joined the Dashwood Book. And then my favorite book is in fact that so sorry, Mark. Thank you. My since I'm also a publisher, and then this is my 12 books. And this book is done by a Hong Kong-based photographer, Win Sha. It's about that Wong Kar-wai's behind-the-scene photo book, as well as that his personal snapshot. And it's got a lot of image from Happy Together and not Chunking Express, but Mood for Love. I decided to work for Win Sha just because that despite of the popularity of Wong Kar-wai, I don't see the many book focus on that his film, and it's important to bring that bigger audience because photo book is such a small community, and then it's important to cross over that as a gender, as a type of the art such as film, so that I can provide that bigger appreciation to the wider audience. So that's one of the reasons why that I chose the Win Sha. He used to be a location photographer of the Wong Kar-wai back in the 90s. And then, yeah, that's my favorite book right now. Thank you very much.
I just want to point out how impressive it is that you've put out that many publications. Just so incredible. I think my relationship started early on. I was always a collector, borderline collier brother, but always collecting things. Baseball cards, had images on them as a young man, comic books, posters in particular. And as I got my first jobs in New York City, I was moving from an independent record label to working at a big record company, CBS. And I lived downtown, and I really felt like taking that job was a big compromise in my life on my ideals of independent music. So I decided that I would buy an art or photography book every time I crossed 14th Street, because I lived downtown, and Sony was, or CBS was at Black Rock. And that really started the habit of collecting books, and photography for books in particular, and images to a certain extent, because during that time I was very interested in the images going up on the streets of New York and how they were the most highly refined marketing and photography images through commercial photography, fashion photography, all of that. And I did something crazy by striking a deal with the Street Snipe team to put them on my mailing list for every record that came out at a record company. And they would drop 3 copies of every poster they put up on the city streets to my doorman, which is now tens of thousands of posters almost going through a floor in a building. I'm grateful to be living in a former printing house that made books with 6-foot cement floors that can support bookcases. If anybody has read the recent Zadie Smith book, the first chapter is about bookcases falling through the floor of a house. And the proprietor of the house is dating a mistress who's trying to put them all back together. And the other person who keeps the library is in shock because, no, these books belong here and these books belong here. And that's sort of the life of a photo book collector. You really are out there trying to assemble images, complete collections, and I think that's been the transition into collecting photography. I think I put up 1 or 2 books of importance. So I put up Louis Baltz, and I had another book about protesting, two areas of through lines for me. Baltz shot the technology series, which I thought was really seminal, which was documenting important places and computational. So there's a picture of a CERN computer, which looks like a living room practically. On the right, that's a single computer at CERN Labs. And I also have that print, 1 of 8, which is about the size of this screen hanging in our house. But the attention to technology and how technology affected photography has always been something really important to me, because it's a through line that continues to this day, and how we both encode and decode images. The other book was, real quickly, because I couldn't come to a single book of reference there, was on natural history of protesting. And that book is really interesting because it was a book that's really nice and small, which is a format I really love, right? It's all vernacular photographs of protest in Iceland, of all places, undated, and they're all full bleed, black and white halftone, and it's unclear who shot them and for what reason, like were the oppressors shooting it or the protesters shooting it, right? So what I loved about it is that the encoding of the image that you're seeing or the decoding on your side has to happen on your side. You have to say, oh, this is what I'm seeing here, and this is why that's important. So both are central themes that I might come back to, but I'd also point out that I would pick two totally different books today. And I just thought those were of the moment when we decided to do it, but they're both important in my mind.
Great. So before we really get in any deeper, Noa, could you go into a little bit about how photo books operate in this larger photographic landscape for artists?
Yeah, sure. I think photo books are extremely vital to the overall kind of photo world and I guess publishing ecology that exists. And I think any artist or artist working in photography would argue the same thing. I think on one hand, it offers the opportunity for artists to put out in the world and publish different kinds of work that otherwise they would not be able to in a gallery or kind of installation setting. And I think that creative opportunity as its own medium is really exciting for a lot of artists and photographers. I think, of course, there's the built-in networks of distribution that come with publishing and the kind of level of access that the work gets, that where you're able, as an artist, to really share your work with a much wider audience than you might reach with a show. And then the other side of that is the kind of permanence of the book as a more utilitarian object than something like a print. I think artists really appreciate the fact that they have this object that they can share with people, that collects their work, that they can show off, that they can take off a shelf, that's not that precious, but could be, I suppose, but that exists in permanence after the show is deinstalled, for example. So all of those kind of factors. And I think at Aperture, part of our consideration a lot of the time is whether we want the photo book to operate more so as an art object or an art book or as more of that kind of utilitarian resource. So this is a very long-winded answer, but I did want to share a couple of examples from the recent Aperture catalog just to kind of walk through different ways we've thought about this. The first of which is Dina Lawson's monograph, and this is kind of in that artist book, art book world and direction, I suppose. And this was published in 2018, and at the time that Dina came to us and told us that she wanted to do this book, she was well known in the art world. She had had shows and I think was probably well collected. She had been featured in the magazine, so there was a kind of pre-existing relationship. But because she had this breadth of work, it really made our lives kind of easier, or at least more focused in thinking of what we could do with these images and what kind of book we wanted to make. And we landed on a really kind of elegant publication where the main focus was to highlight the quality of her images. If you see her images in person, they're large format portraits. They're printed very large on the wall, and you kind of get this very immersive, detail-rich experience. And we thought for her first book, we wanted to preserve that level of fidelity and integrity in the images and to the best we could in a book form. So the book is oversized. It's about 14 by 12, and there's a very, very tight edit of only 40 images, but they're all really amazing images. They're all bangers. And the attention really was to the quality of the printing and the paper. So each image is afforded a lot of white space on the page. You can really spend time of it and get immersed in the same kind of way that you might when you are looking at her work on the wall. So that is strategy, like the first kind of strategy. Another way we look at things is more in the kind of resource direction. And I think Ming Smith's book is a great example of this if you want to go to that slide. this was published in 2020, and for those of you who don't know Ming Smith and her work, she was a photographer who primarily worked in the 70s and 80s, photographing in Harlem and in New York, taking photographs of Black life and Black culture. She amassed a really extraordinary body of photographs over her prolific career, but unfortunately, her practice was not as well known as it should have been at the time. It was only until recent years when this book came out and when she had a show at MoMA that she really got her flowers. So with that kind of consideration in mind, we knew that this book had to encapsulate a lot more work than a book like Dina Lawson's, which only had 40 images, really give the scope of her career and be bolstered by a collection of critical writing. So while I believe there's only one text in Dina's book, there's 5 or 6 essays in this monograph, essays by people like Greg Tate. There's a conversation with Arthur Jafa with the intention of setting the table for her practice and making an argument for her entry into the photographic canon. And I think this was another successful, albeit different, direction. And I know I've been talking for a long time already, but there's one more example of just the kind of more traditional catalog approach. When you think about an exhibition catalog, it's that same kind of idea of setting the table for a group of artists, maybe this time, around a central theme, but really bolstered by a certain level of scholarship. And I think our recent publication of I'm So Happy You're Here, which focuses on Japanese women photographers from the 1950s until now, is a great example of that. It features 25 featured artists in a portfolio, but there's also an illustrated and narrated bibliography. There's 3 texts by scholars, and there's a number of essays and conversations in translation for the first time. So those are 3 examples of how we think about books on the scale of being an art book, versus more of a kind of catalog or resource. But I'll stop there because I've been talking enough.
I was going to say, one of my vens of collecting is like artist book, monograph with a barcode, and books that don't have barcodes.
Yeah, right.
And it's like
you can
the ven
sometimes
in the
tell.
middle that's interesting. There's 2 points that I think are really important that you hit on about, we talked about it as a group, but photography books provide a really great point of access for people who can't get access to everything or don't have access to a museum or to the prints. And in collecting, a collection, in my mind, is made to be shared. So by collecting photo books and just keeping them to yourself, it's really, in a weird way, selfish. So, the philosophy I come from is like a collection is made to be shared and shared with others, so you could see the curation of what you're looking at and why you thought those sort of cuts were really important in your collection. And I think both of those things are super, super important as onboarding into collecting or actually understanding the things. And the only other thing I'll say about collecting is that curatorial sort of, curation starts broad, the forest, and you cut it down to the trees that are the right ones for you. A horrible metaphor here, but at the same point, once you start to understand that cut, that opinion is formed by talking to you guys. Like when I sit and come into Dashwood and I talk to Miwa, or I'm speaking with you tonight, it's unconsciously providing me with ways of how I should be looking at collecting and what's important and why. And I think that sort of unconsciousness through dialogue, unconscious understanding of what's important through these type of dialogues. And I think the most meaningful points with photography for me has been sitting in an acquisition meeting at a photography institution and speaking to a book or a photo for like an hour. Just a single photo for an hour. And that for me was just like mind-blowing on like how much you can cull out of it and how hard it is to just speak to what you're seeing. Like, this is a picture of, and why is it important? Sorry. No.
Miwa, I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience at Dashwoods and what your audience is like. Is it mostly collectors, or how are people really interacting with photo books there?
Yeah. my client at the Dashwood is a photographer mainly, and then they love that collecting a book. And then we also have people from Hollywood and then music and also, they're lawyer and the real estate agent or financial software engineer. And we have a client from all over the occupation. I think they believe that they get like a bigger appreciation collecting a photo book. I can convince all of you, like if you listen to music on the iPhone, such as like a Spotify, yes, you enjoy listening to the music from Spotify, but if you go to a music concert, your appreciation is bigger. Same with a book. If you just enjoy the photography on the Instagram, it's fine. But if you have a photo book in hand, your appreciation, your love for photography is bigger. So your emotion is bigger when you come across that the physical experience. Therefore, Dashwood is still growing. It's so surprising to me too. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I find our city great, to be honest with you, and I can't imagine it without it. It's a cultural resource. It's a fireplace for the community, and there's not once I've gone in there and just bought a book. I've always had an incredible experience. You're a master curator with people and calling out why they're there, what books they're looking for, and then it usually opens up into a conversation between the whole store. And some people are a little uncomfortable at a certain point, but then they get in the conversation. And again, that's where like we start to uncode and understand what's important.
Yeah, like algorithm is really make our society is convenient, chat GPT or, it's all about the big data. And I think that when you have like a bookstore, curation is the most important aspect because that unless you have like a voice, you don't really collect that certain type of the photo book. We don't want to compete with a big market like Amazon. We like to be narrow and then focus. I think to survive like an independent bookstore, we care about that careful selection of the photo book that we believe is the best.
I feel like you guys are also do such a good job in programming to hosting events around photography and facilitating that kind of conversation that happens when you just go to the store to buy a book. In other contexts too, it really feels like it's a salon or a forum for people who love photo books to come and gather and talk and enjoy them. So it's such a great spot.
I totally admire that my boss David Strato's vision because that to just make a profit, he should just have like a most collectible book from 60s or 70s. But he have like a bigger vision. He serve for the community. For me, he's like a contemporary Andy Warhol. He have like such a unique store in downtown and then bring that creative community together. I really love that his vision. That's the reason why that I still stay after 20 years.
Mark, can you tell us a little bit about your journey collecting, how you began, and maybe how your motivations have evolved since then?
It had to evolve for a number of reasons. Like, there's 3 Ds that supposedly drive collecting: death, divorce, and death, right? Those are the things that force collections into the marketplace. I started collecting way too wide. I started refining my collection through conversations with my friend Charlotte Cotton, who's put out some incredible books on photography. I highly recommend them. And as I started to realize that I didn't have both the resources and the finances and the space to like put together the largest, widest photography collection, because it goes back to the turn of the century till now. So I had to focus on some specific areas, and I decided to focus on areas that why I was drawn to photo books is because they're telling stories, and stories and art are how we move society forward in many ways, right? And sometimes it's not easily perceived why that piece moved us forward. But it allows that sort of door to open because it's sort of vague at first and the interpretation happens. So I started to focus on books that I thought really mattered around protest, around the measure of the gaze. So I put out the surveillance index and I talk about sharing books. The books were, it was a list of 100 books that looked at the measure of the gaze, because that camera has an endpoint and it's not just a photograph anymore. It's a lot more. There's machines behind it that can infer all sorts of things, down to intent at this point in our lives. So understanding that measure of a gaze and who controls that and what does that look like, I thought was important. And then sharing that, so taking those 100 books, putting it into a publication, and then taking them and shipping them across the Atlantic to a place called La Balle, a wonderful book and gallery in Paris, and shared them with people. There were some pictures, if you float through there, that you could see both the concept of it. That was a poster made for the book. We literally staged it and then built a giant tower of books for people to actually come in and access all the books. And it was an incredible period of an opening where people just showed up, talked to the docents. All the docents were informed about all 100 books. So anyone could walk in and say, I'd like to look at that Adam Bromberg book on facial recognition, where you can just see the front of their face, and they can go in there and explain exactly what that book was and why it was in there. So the two components there for me was honing the collection, staying a little bit away from the traditional male canon, to be honest with you, because I looked at my collection at one point and I was a little shocked on how it had developed. So I had to spend time querying the collection, as I learned through the ICP, and making sure that the balance was there and it represented the diversity of stories that I wanted to be able to collect and share.
So do you have where you kind of envision this collection living long term in your head?
So as anybody, and as a collector, you know other collectors, and we all think about things like flood, fire, and where does the books go after we're done, right? And I believe that the tighter collections within the collection are unique bodies of work, right? So if I've taken the time to curate something and put it into a list of 100 things, that's a unique body of work, and that belongs somewhere that's related to that. So in my mind, the only person I've seen keep a collection intact is Karl Lagerfeld in the Morgan Library, and Karl sold everything else but his books, and that still exists as a salon like this in Paris for special events, right? And the Morgan Library, and of course, schools and institutes of higher learning. And I've spent a lot of time recently at NYU as an entrepreneur in residence working with students there. I did that primarily to give back, but also to get a library access. And when I got library access, I nearly died, okay? Because the depth and incredible stuff in there, it just made me cry. And what's the hardest thing about it is, like, I wanted to get access to ephemera, photos from club invites, right? It's a 12-part process. You literally have to fill out more forms than, naturalization. And that's the part of like collecting that bumps me out, because that kind of access allows us to build off of the derivative works and create new derivative works and new understandings around things, or understanding the body of works that they made. So I found that both thrilling and scary, and that's why I share my collection more widely as possible. Invite people into our house if they really want. It's in the Hudson Street Library. It's literally an apartment on Hudson Street, so it's a legitimate name. It's not like just manufactured, and there's access, which is really important. So focus, I think, is the biggest, shortest answer to your question, is focusing on specific genres.
But this library is completely open to the public?
They have to call and make an appointment
Right.
or email, but yeah.
But nice.
And we take it on the road.
Nice. Oh, do you know where it's going? Do you have
Not
places where
next.
Okay.
I would like to
That's
actually
coming.
revisit La Balle again, because the French really, really, really value the photo book and books. And seeing the turnout there and seeing how well planned it was. I mean, as a book collector, I was worried about the books, their first editions, and I'm saying, okay, everybody can touch them, and how they orchestrated that and how well they did it. And so Index 2, I would love to see there, but there's so many other areas of photography I want to explore, so it's a challenge.
I do want to talk a little bit about the design of the photo book. So how do the different priorities of artists manifest in the design? And this is for Noa and Miwa.
I think for us, it really depends on the artist. Some artists really have a strong hand and a strong idea of what they want their project to be. Earlier this evening, I was talking about our latest book with Paul Sapuya called Darkroom A through Z. And from the get-go, Paul knew what kind of book he wanted. And I think it helps that he has a background in bookmaking, and bookmaking is a big part of his practice. But really from the get-go, he wanted this book to function as a literal index of the key themes and ideas behind one body of work. So the entire design of that book was built around that. He worked really closely with this design studio in LA called Polymode, who he's actually neighbors with. So that book felt very out of our hands. It was very much a collaboration between artist and designer, and their kind of workshopping of it. And the end product is this amazing resource. It's quite dense, but it's also really incredible and visually impactful. But it does feel like you're reading a kind of technical book, and that is the kind of idea that I think Paul wanted. Other artists are very hands-off, and part of our role in editorial is to, when we get the kind of book proposal, think about who the best designer from our kind of network of people that we usually work with would work best for this person if they have less of a kind of particular thing that they're going for. So it's always a conversation, and the artist has input along the way. We send them design drafts from the designer, and they often give rounds of feedback, but the level to which they're engaged, I think it depends on personality, as does a lot of things in
I think that the design is divided into like three categories. Number one, if you self-publish the book, you kind of design everything. You edit everything on your own. And then if you work with the independent publisher, they kind of invite that designer who have like an experimental or creative idea for the bookmaking. If you work for the bigger publisher like Steidl, they must have an in-house designer. Their book look always same and then classy. So it's really depending on that the publisher. However, I have to say, like a photographer is good at taking a picture. How they don't know how to fabricate the book, so it should be like a more like a collaboration with the editor, designer, printer, and the binder. So photo book is like a performing art or architecture, I would say, so that many people have to collaborate together.
And Mark, you've talked before about the themes that you're focusing on in your collecting, but does the design of the book sway you one way or another? How does it affect the process?
Well, two parts. When I produced my first photo book, Miwa suggested a designer, Alex Lin, who I ended up working with, and I can't tell you how much I learned the importance of design into books, and not just producing the book, but collateral around it, bookmarks, bags, everything, posters to promote it, etc. And I've already left on the second part of your question, or
Just how does it affect as you're acquiring
Oh,
books?
so the quality of the book, unless it's made to be, there's so many different types of books. There's the books that you want to keep on yourself as reference that are books on books. There's books that you pick up and use as reference and flip through. And now that I've blown up my collection and blew it out of alpha, I've now started to group things sometimes. I just want spiral notebooks together because spiral bindings are a thing all of a sudden, and they're really neat, and they're all pink for some reason. So I ended up saying, okay, here's my pink spiral binding collection, or really small photo books, which I think are pretty tight, under 7 inches, right, that you can carry it. The book I produced was true to the size of all the books I photographed, so it was a massively sized book because it was like if the book was big, the picture was big because I showed all the edges. And when you build a big photo book, retail has to find a space to put it, and sending it through the mail is super, super expensive. So those are two things I learned about, like the manufacturing and the design process. I don't know how to do better with that.
Can you tell us the earliest book that you have in your collection?
I have a lot of books that cover early photography. I think I could say Robert Frank's Americans, 58, some of the Balls books, Nevada, and Tesla, which was 71 by,
Larry Clark, Tulsa.
yeah, Larry Clark, who just came out with another amazing book. I thought it was interesting that all my older books were named after states or the history of America, as Robert Frank viewed it. But I think those are some of the earlier ones. There are a lot of books that cover the beginning of photography and that canon, the Steichen, and all of those things, but they're reprints versus the originals.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested in the different themes that you've seen in your collection, but also Noa and Miwa in your experience as well. The themes in photo books that you've kind of seen come to the forefront and then fade. And
I find that the power politics is the biggest theme in the U.S. It's about that, ethnicity and gender and then labor. So U.S. is always about that power politics. And then in Europe, UK, and Japan, they don't mind not talking about the politics. They just go for like a studio work or a snapshot. So it's less political, I would say.
Yeah. I feel like I've seen recently a lot of smaller books like this. The scale of books seems to have been scaled down from like larger coffee table books. I think in part because they're harder to sell. Yeah. And if you have a really oversized book, a lot of booksellers are like, why, what am I going to do with this? And who's going to buy it? So I think that's part of the reason, but I think also it's like people want something they can hold in their hands and to access and to read and engage with actually more closely than having to like put a book on a table and like flip through it. I feel like soft cover is pretty in vogue these days too. I think that kind of like scaling back from the austerity again of like a huge hardcover book and something a little more personal is something that I've seen recently, but also agree with everything.
Yeah, +1 on all of those.
Yeah.
Mark, anything in your collection?
Anything?
Any themes or things that you've seen over the span from that earliest book until now?
I have scaled away from the large sort of monographs or coffee table books because they seem to be objet versus, something that you want to dig into. When I made my book, Alex Lin, the designer, said, it's like a phone book. You can hold it, it's soft cover, you can flip through it. And again, accessibility. The problem like with books also as a collector is you want to keep them nice. So a book comes into my collection, the accession process is like documenting it, then mylaring it, and then potentially putting it in a plastic bag to protect it from spells. And then that's when you realize, oh my God, you're locking the thing up again, and everyone needs to see it. But that process and theme of like taking good care of books, the theme that trend to smaller from larger. I like perfect bindings. I like spiral bindings. I like all sorts of different types of bindings. But yeah, I think the accessibility and the access to it is really, really important now. Concurring with him.
Nice. Any advice that all three of you have for collectors starting to build their own photo book collections?
I'll start only because like collecting is like understand what you want to collect and why first. Why is it important to you? Like for me, I try not to buy anything, music, book, art, anything that I won't wake up in the middle of the night to go listen to or read or look through. It's got to break emotional ground for me. And that's the first rule, or it's got to be important from a documentation standpoint. Like, we talked a little bit about books on books, that these are the most important books of photography from this person, or these are the books from this country. And that certainly really helps you buy less and understand more.
I'm probably not the expert here. I think if I were to give advice about this, it would probably just be like start going with the books that you're most inclined to buy when you see them, and then learn from them, learn what you like, learn about photography, and then keep going from there, I guess. And everything Mark said too. Yeah, he's the expert.
My first sort of curatorial cut was taking what you just said, pick up a book, flip through it, realize whether I had any affinity to it, and if I could count 3 or 4 images that I felt were like sort of sacred or meaningful, that was like, okay, let me start with that. And then I literally progressed from there to more refined thinking about it. But that's a perfectly great place to be, and I'm there now. I do that all the time. It's like, oh, there's something there, this artist starting to make something, and then you follow that artist along the way. You know, very often you see their work mature over time, and you were really glad you were there in the beginning.
Yeah. So lastly, I would love for each of you to talk about what projects you're currently working on.
I'm working on that best book of the year for the Photo Eye. Photo Eye is like one of the best bookstore in the U.S. They are in Santa Fe, and they invite the specialist to talk about the best book of the year. So I'm writing a review right now. If you like to collect a book, I highly recommend that you visit their website, because they list like a vintage and a new book, and you understand the market of photo book industry.
Can you tell us what it is yet, or is it still a secret? Okay. I'm working on a bunch of books, as always. Right now, I'm working on a book with Richard Miserak for a new body of work focusing on cargo ships. We're working on a book as part of our Aperture Ideas series, which are like text-focused books, focusing on essays by the Provoke photographer Takuma Nakahira. We're working on a book with Tyler Mitchell, which will be out in the coming years, which is really exciting. A book with Alejandra Cartagena. A lot of different things. You're always doing a lot, for sure. So,
Mark?
2 things. One, I'm glad didn't leak into the conversation, understanding how to provide artists with tools that work with AI to further their craft versus subvert it. I have a shirt that says "Rage Against Machine Learning," so I believe artists forward. And I've been collaborating with Charlotte Cotton, who we did the public-private secret stuff for a while. I'm not a traditional image maker, but image-driven and image-forward. And several other people like that are collaborating on a book, just sharing how we collect, use, and sort of understand the world through imagery. Nothing I not hate, but I don't love autobiographical photography, just the stuff, Instagram. But I think this will be interesting. It's more along the lines of, say, supermarket of images, or certain books that fall into that category, which is just a massive collection of images that are helping you interpret what you're dealing with every day.
Thank you all for sharing. We have some time for Q&A, so if anyone has some questions, please feel free. Don't be shy.
Mark, as someone with extensive experience at emerging technologies and sits at the intersection of tech and photography, I hope to steal a few seconds after this. My question in relation to photo books is, if any of you happen to make it to the Ez Devlin exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt Museum and decided to add her photo book to your collection, and your thoughts on it.
I haven't seen it yet, but that's great.
Shall be done.
It's amazing.
Shall be done.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
And that's how, I often find out about things. There's someone telling you about it, and then you going to it firsthand, and then realizing, wow, how did I miss this? And that's why the city is so great. It's so deep in this stuff. Thank you for sharing.
Of course.
So my question comes as maybe a casual collector. For anyone who may not know, I work at Fotografiska on the marketing team, and through Fotografiska, I've had the pleasure of growing a pretty extensive photo book collection from some of our exhibitions. And, through that experience, I've been very grateful to receive many discounts on some of our books. Maybe this is a question for Noa or Miwa, but as someone who is collecting pretty casually and more for fun than anything serious, what maybe advice would you have for how to adequately budget for a book, or when you're kind of pricing books, like what goes into determining that price point, and how would you know if the value of a book that you're picking up is appropriate? And I don't know if that answers. That's a clear question.
Yeah, I mean, we have a sales team at Aperture that are the experts in this, but this is a really good question actually, and one that we're always having conversations about. In fact, for some of our books, the price point before it gets released really fluctuates, and we operate as a not-for-profit, so I think part of the considerations are how we have to price things based on how much funding we get for a certain project. But I think it's always related to the quality and the materials. There's some books that are very expensive to make, but weirdly don't feel expensive, but they still have to be priced at a certain way to make them feasible as like objects in the market. But I think we really try to kind of find the balance between the kind of production of a book and and the target audience. I think that we spend a lot of time thinking about that. In terms of like, are you buying a book and is it your value going to be collected? I wouldn't think about like buying a book in that kind of way. I think it's whether if you really feel the desire to own it and look at the work and engage with it, and you feel like the work speaks to you in some way. At least that's how I buy books. It's probably not the most fiscally responsible, but I feel like I go to Print and Matter or something, and I'm just like, oh my God, I have to buy this book. I'm so sorry to my credit card statement. So, yeah.
When I price the book, I need to just simply make like a spreadsheet as a publisher, and then make sure that how much production cost it take, and then you need to give a 40% discount to bookstore. So let's say if the book is $40, you need to sell the copy to the bookstore for $24, and then how much I should get the profit. So it's really all about the math, and then to buy a book from the other people, I really care about how much I love this book. Unless I love the book, I'm not gonna able to recommend the client. So it's really just not so much like thinking about the future investment. I need to make sure that I love the book. So it doesn't matter how much it is. It's more like a content of the book.
Just one pro tip is like Monday mornings and Tuesday mornings at 10 at Strand is where they take all the books that they bought the week before and put it on a cart in the back on the right. And that's my favorite treasure trove of like getting really great books at really affordable prices. And because they bought them and then they reprice them far less than you would see the original. And I've found just today I was speaking with another collector, and for 15 minutes we were talking about like how we found these incredible books at these incredible prices. That's the greatest joy as a collector, is finding something that way. Serendipity is the win always for me.
It's really clear that you've all grown in your field extensively and you've built your career in this, but I think a two-part question is, was there a theme that in the beginning of starting in this, did you really gravitate towards, and how has that progressed now to where you are now? Like, is there a theme now that you really gravitate towards as opposed to the beginning of when you first started this? And then secondly, I think any creative can probably agree that sometimes there are moments where you're lacking inspiration or you need something to reignite. And is there a book that has particularly reignited something in you of you're like, oh, this is why I got into this. This reminds me of why I began in this field?
Well, as a Japanese, I'm such a like a linear thinker. I don't like to waste my time or energy, so I'm just so like straightforward. But photo book is about like a organic emotion. Sometimes doesn't make sense. I feel like as I get familiar and experience about photo book, my appreciation of the photo book become bigger. So it's not like a philosophy, like one word equal to another word. Photography is bigger than word, and then you have to just feel it. That abstract emotion is very precious to me, and I gained this kind of appreciation as I work for the Dashwood for the last 20 years.
I think just for me, it's what's important. And, again, stories are the way we move forward. Art is the way we move forward. Visual storytelling is a really critical component of that. Focusing on stuff that's a little less pedestrian and stuff that moves us forward as a society has been my predominant shift, is like diversity in what I collect, and that in service of change.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you guys said. It's really, I don't think of it, when I buy a photo book, it's not so much as does it fit the other photo books I have, but more so like, oh, do I really like this in isolation, I guess. In terms of a book that I really like that I find inspiration in a lot is, I love Gregory Halpern's Omaha sketchbook. So I just love the use of like imagery and materiality suggested in that book, and I feel like it's so brilliant and so like I think the like lower key books that do a simple thing really really well, and that book is a good example of that too.
Sometimes you could just buy a book because the way they use light and color.
Yeah.
And you may not relate to any of the photographs, but the light and color is just so well done.
Yeah.
And you're like, it's important. I need this.
Any other questions? If not, we want to thank Meredith and the panel for being here. We want to thank you so much for being here at NeueHouse, Madison Square.
Thank
And,
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Just a quick other show by round of applause. Do we have any Fotografiska New York members here? One, two, a couple. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. And if you're not yet a member, you can see Kayla on the way out and find out more about how to become a member, and at least joining our mailing list, please, so you can find out more about these great events that we're hosting here at NeueHouse. We also have a contemporary music festival that we're hosting at the Blue Building, which is an incredible jam. That's on 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd. It's just one of those rare Manhattan locations that don't really seem to exist anymore. So I encourage you to find out everything we're doing while we search for our new home in New York. So thanks, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.